and welcome. I am so delighted to introduce Rachel Marston, class of 2021, as today's speaker. I was honored to have worked with Rachel across her time at Tufts. Rachel served as an ENV1, Introduction to Environmental Studies, undergraduate teaching assistant. She was my academic advisee, and she wrote an amazing senior honors thesis that I hope she will publish, entitled Unsettling Right Lock and Restoring the Land, Centering Indigenous Histories in Environmental Education. Rachel received a Bachelor's of Arts from Tufts University with a double major in applied environmental studies with a concentration in environmental communications and anthropology. Today, Rachel is the research project manager for justice and equity at the Environmental Defense Fund. At the Environmental Defense Fund, her work is focused on developing the Frontline Resource Institute, a project of the Environmental Defense Fund that seeks to support frontline community-based organizations working to advance environmental and climate justice. She oversees all research and strategy development activities for the Institute, focused on community-driven, equitable research strategies and leveraging social science for systems change. I'm sure we're going to be hearing a lot more about that work from her in a few minutes. Rachel was also a Tom Graff Fellow at EDF, working across the justice and equity team to develop program strategy and project management plans. And she led also the Frontline Resource Institute's day-to-day operations. So without further ado, I'm so excited to hear from Rachel Marston.
Thank you so much. Is the mic on? I think it's working. Oh yes, it's working. Okay. Hello everyone. I'm so honored to be here. Thank you for that extremely kind introduction, Dr. Stein. I am so honestly humbled in many ways when I was invited to be here. I was honestly at the other side of this room not very long ago. As you know, you heard in my introduction, I graduated in 2021, and it's been a very interesting journey since then, but it's just wonderful to be back here with you all today and to be a part of the environmental studies community. So I'll just go ahead and dig in because I have a lot to talk about today. So I was invited to talk about a few things today. I'm going to start with an overview of my path thus far and how Tufts environmental studies really shaped me. And then I'll dig into a few quick definitions just to make sure we all have a shared understanding of some of the terms I'll be using throughout my talk, namely environmental justice, frontline communities, and community-based organizations. Then I'll provide a brief overview of my work on the Justice and Equity team at EDF, where I, as Dr. Stein said, have been leading the development of the Frontline Resource Institute. And that is, again, a project of the environmental justice team at EDF, and it is really looking to leverage the power and positionality of a large organization like Environmental Defense Fund to support capacity building for frontline community-based organizations. I'll use the learnings from my work to talk about the important and somewhat contradictory potential for large environmental NGOs to really support environmental justice and environmental organizations as allies, despite a really long history of tension and sometimes hierarchy between these two sections of the environmental movement. And perhaps most critically, I'll end with the importance of centering frontline communities as leaders within the environmental movement at large, and I'll provide some key takeaways for everyone in this room to carry forward, no matter where you sit in the movement, whether you're a student, grad student, an educator, or a community member. But first, a little bit about me. So when I talk about my time at Tufts, I always like to say that I followed my nose to environmental studies. My freshman year fall, I took environmental biology with Professor Oriens, and I really enjoyed it. So in the spring, I took environmental justice and world literature with Professor Roy, and environment communication and culture with Dr. Stein, and the rest was history from there. I also like to joke that from that point on, I just followed Dr. Stein around and she couldn't get rid of me for the next 3 years. So Her mentorship really led me to where I am today. But in all seriousness, the environmental studies program here was the best place I could have ended up. And I really consider this community one of the best decisions I ever made becoming a part of it. Tufts Environmental Studies was and still is aligned with my personal goals and created a comfortable environment for me to push myself and think critically about the systems that we've inherited and how we really might make those systems better and even create new systems and build new tables. I also majored in anthropology, which provided the perfect complement to environmental studies at the intersection of people, environment, theory, and practice. I also really enjoyed working on my thesis under Dr. Stein's mentorship, as she mentioned. I won't go too far into it because you already provided a fantastic overview, but in this thesis, I had the opportunity to do really deep archival research into the history of a local historical farm. And in that, I was really thinking through the significance of colonial sites on stolen land and how those sites sit in the public consciousness and what it means to unsettle colonial histories. The opportunity to pursue this research and Dr. Stein's mentorship was, both of those are honestly something I'm so grateful for. Both of those opportunities led me to pursue this career at the intersection of environmental justice and organizational change, while also really forming my personal values and goals and understanding of the world. After graduating from Tufts, I really just fell into my work at EDF. I was talking to Coco earlier, and I actually didn't have a job when I graduated because I was so busy with my thesis. So I walked dogs for 6 months in Washington, D.C. before finally getting interviews with Environmental Defense Fund. And from there, it just clicked. I applied for a 2-year fellowship called the Tom Graff Fellowship, which was really focused on increasing environmental justice work at organizations like EDF. And my fellowship in particular was specifically attached to this project called the Frontline Resource Institute. About a year and a half ago, I moved into my current role as a full-time employee after finishing my fellowship, and now I really focus on research and strategy for that same project. But before I get too far into my work at EDF, I'll get a little bit deeper into some of the projects and what some of those things mean. I want to jump into some quick context and background about environmental justice and the environmental justice movement to really ground the rest of my talk. So the environmental justice space is a broad and intersectional field, just like the environmental movement itself. And you'll get varied definitions of environmental justice depending on who you ask and what they do and where they sit in the movement. So I wanted to take a moment to quickly define some of these terms, just so we all have a shared understanding. It's all clear between everyone in the audience and myself what I mean when I say these words. But I do want to stress that there's not a single definition of each of these. These are my personal definitions influenced by the context of EDF and the Frontline Resource Institute. So when I say environmental justice, or EJ, I'm talking about a state where all individuals, regardless of race, income, socioeconomic status, national origin, or really any other identifier, has the fundamental right to a clean, healthy, and safe environment. And the environment in this case is where we live, work, and play. The definition here assumes that environmental justice is intersectional, meaning that an environmental injustice can encompass anything from industrial air pollution to green space access, from toxic prisons to labor rights for farm workers, and a whole other slew of issues that I haven't mentioned. These injustices find root causes in oppressive societal structures like racism, colonialism, imperialism, capitalism. I could go on. And addressing these environmental injustices requires not only remedying the immediate causes and the immediate harms, but also directly addressing these root causes and systems. And by addressing those root causes, we prevent similar injustices from occurring in the future. That's a core part of environmental injustice and really achieving that state. I also use the term frontline community to refer to those who are hit, quote, first and worst by the environmental harms caused by climate change. This is a emerging definition that many folks are using this kind of first and worst framework to describe the people who are being hit hardest by climate change. And these communities are disproportionately communities of color, and they face really unique challenges in the fight against climate change, aside from the environmental harms themselves. For example, they have lots of barriers to accessing resources like funding and other organizational infrastructure. Frontline communities are often discussed as passively receiving the first and worst environmental harms. But from my perspective, it's really important to note that many frontline communities are both actively and collectively resisting the systems of oppression that cause climate change. And I really seek to center this definition in my work and in my work at EDF and the Frontline Resource Institute. And lastly, I just want to take a quick moment to note the definition of community-based organizations in case anyone isn't familiar with those. These are the entities that are frequently nonprofits or other projects that represent specific frontline communities and their stakeholders. So when I talk about supporting frontline communities, I'm most likely talking about frontline community-based organizations, as they're organizing for the health and well-being of their communities through that structure. So like I mentioned earlier, I work at Environmental Defense Fund, which is neither a frontline community-based organization nor an environmental justice organization explicitly. However, EDF is one of the largest and oldest environmental groups in the nation, often called one of the green groups or, quote, big greens. And large environmental groups have had a bit of a rocky history in relationship to the environmental justice movement. From the beginning, the mainstream movement was largely led by white urban elites and really held a preservationist and conservationist perspective above all else. You may have learned about this in some of your courses. And this perspective often led to active discrimination against Indigenous peoples, peoples of color, poor communities, and women, and a whole other set of groups. I'd really highly recommend Dorcetta Taylor's book, The Rise of the American Conservation Movement, Power, Privilege, and Environmental Protection, for a deeper dive into this history, because I can't get into it all here. This ideology really pervaded into the 1980s and 90s, the decades to which many scholars attribute the birth of the American environmental justice movement as we know it. In the 1990s, all of this came to a head when 100 environmental leaders of color, led by the Southwest Organizing Project, sent a letter addressed directly to the leaders of the 10 biggest environmental groups in the country. EDF was one of those organizations. The letter really called for these green groups to be held accountable for working against the environmental priorities of the working class, and also against the priorities of people of color, and to diversify their staff, boards, and memberships. Essentially, this letter was calling out a pattern of large environmental organizations boxing out communities of color, frontline communities, and environmental justice advocates from the solutions that these large environmental organizations were proposing to the climate crisis. The significance of this letter is that it really catalyzed a change. It was received, there was response that was varied across the different organizations, but it catalyzed a change that in many ways is still ongoing. For example, philanthropic disparities still exist, as mainstream environmental organizations still receive the lion's share of funding for environmental work. A study by Dorcetta Taylor and Molly Blondell surveyed more than 30,000 environmental and public health grants and found that more than half of that environmental funding goes to organizations with revenues of $20 million or more. And that's these large environmental groups. By contrast, organizations with revenues under 1 million, like many community-based organizations, received less than 4% of that funding. And just to add another staggering statistic to that, the few largest environmental organizations received more funding than all of the environmental organizations combined as single organizations alone, which is just really highlights the disparity there that exists to this day within philanthropy. And additionally, even though this letter really called for large organizations to diversify their staff and boards, many green groups still are predominantly white. I think most of them are predominantly white, according to Green 2.0, which tracks the demographics of organizations and tries to keep them accountable. There has been improvement, and there's been a lot of commitments, especially since 2020, to diversify environmental organizations, but there remains a lot of work to be done. So now I want to just pivot a little bit to the EDF specific history here and how EDF has dealt with this. So amidst this context, there were lots of staffers at EDF and other environmental organizations doing pivotal work, pushing for environmental justice and collaborating with community-based organizations. But this work was lonely and often volunteer work that occurred either outside of normal hours or as kind of an add-on to their existing jobs. It wasn't until 2020, which, as everyone in this room will probably remember, was a critical moment for justice and equity in both the environmental movement and also in the United States as a whole, that staff really began organizing to change the organization. A group of volunteer staff at EDF established an Environmental Justice Council, which worked together to research and create an environmental justice vision and a set of 10 principles in 3 areas around environmental justice. The vision and principles were officially adopted by the organization in 2021, which was a huge win, and those vision and principles continue to guide our work today. Now, you might be wondering, why this mini history lesson? How does this fit into this presentation? And that's a great question. All of this is important context to understand my work and the work that's happening at EDF to really begin reckoning with this history and systematically integrating environmental justice throughout the organization. My team, the Justice and Equity team, exists to really ensure that these principles, the vision and principles developed by staff, are woven through the fabric of the organization, both internally and in our external presence. So my team does this through our environmental and climate justice strategic plan, which lays out a few key areas in which we seek to facilitate organizational change. First and most immediate is organizational readiness, which really focuses on staff understanding of environmental justice and accountability for addressing environmental justice and equity issues in their work. One of our key focuses here is our Environmental and Climate Justice Intensive, which is a multi-month learning community which supports staff with the tools, resources, and justice-driven leadership skills that they need to integrate environmental justice throughout the organization. Through our organizational readiness work, we really also provide staff with tools to build and maintain equitable and relationship-based partnerships with environmental justice advocates and community-based organizations in EDF's work. Our third pillar here focuses on systemic change, which is the core of embedding justice and equity throughout EDF's work. The crux of this is our EJ vision and principles that I mentioned in the last slide. We're really seeking to make sure that the vision and principles are embedded in all project and team planning across the organization, especially in our mission work, which is our kind of project-based work where people are on the ground doing advocacy and organizing, and also in team planning, among other foundational aspects. And lastly, the piece I really want to focus on the most today is external capacity building. This pillar is where I spend most of my time, or really all of my time on the day-to-day, thinking through how EDF can best leverage its resources and staff knowledge and expertise, and also really its positionality in the environmental movement to support capacity building efforts for community-based organizations. In this case, capacity building means supporting frontline organizations in achieving a state where their organizations can be stable and flexible. And at the same time, their staff can have the bandwidth to do their work without burnout, because burnout is a huge issue in especially the environmental justice space. Much of our work in this area is achieved through the Frontline Resource Institute, which, as has been mentioned before, is a project of my team. And it's also the work I've been managing for 3 years. This is how the idea of the Frontline Resource Institute was born. I'm going to dig a little bit into that process and how we got here. So that idea, the seed was planted for that idea when my team leader, Dr. Margot Brown, who is the Senior Vice President for Justice and Equity at EDF, joined the organization in early 2021. In her early days at EDF, she had over 200 conversations with individuals across multiple sectors: academia, green groups, environmental justice organizations, philanthropy. She spoke to some of her former federal colleagues, and even in the corporate sector, about how organizations like EDF could best support environmental justice, especially given their history in the movement. And from those conversations, one resounding theme arose: capacity. This idea that frontline groups know what they need to achieve well-being for their communities and are already doing incredible work. They don't need to be told what to do, but that they need more resources and infrastructural support to achieve their goals. So thinking back to some of those points I made earlier about philanthropy in the environmental movement and the underfunding of environmental justice, this gap is systemic. Marginalized groups really face barriers, not just to funding, but also to other resources like data, scientific support, legal support, strategic planning, and even simply having the opportunity to network with each other and share strategies. The idea that EDF had something to offer here was a pretty radical one at the beginning. That EDF could best support environmental justice and the work of frontline organizations, not by offering them solutions or swooping into advocacy campaigns, but rather through offering organizational support for the existing work and priorities of frontline groups. This idea really required EDF to take a step back and recognize its positionality in the movement. So Dr. Brown created the project with the intent to eventually spin it off as its own organization, allowing it to essentially be incubated with EDF support and then spinning it off to become an independent entity. It's kind of like a startup within the organization. I came onto the project in late 2021 and have been supporting the project ever since. And now my role is, again, really in research, strategy, and thinking about how we can create a model from the Frontline Resource Institute for other organizations to follow. From the beginning, we really knew that FREE couldn't be created by EDF alone, especially given this history. So we worked with someone who is a great mentor to me, Vernice Miller-Travis, who is a pivotal figure in the environmental justice movement, and her colleagues at the Metropolitan Group, which is a consulting firm, to determine a plan for ensuring that FREE was created by and for frontline communities. The idea was that they would be calling the shots behind the scenes, and we as EDF staff would be really acting on their priorities and identifying opportunities to address the needs that they identified. So with the support of Bernice Miller-Travis and the Metropolitan Group, we convened a committee of 11 environmental and climate justice leaders and practitioners from across the United States. And they have really varied expertise. They're from different regions, different topic areas, different lived experiences, different ages, generations. It's a really wonderful group of people. And many of them are pictured on this slide. This photo is from an August 2023 convening where we met to finalize our strategic plan. And I've learned so much from them. It's been fantastic to have the opportunity to just soak in all of their knowledge. But they are the lifeblood of everything that we do. They really guide, as I said, the strategy, the prioritization, and then we act. Over a 2-year process, the conceptual committee worked to define a strategy for FREE. We facilitated the strategic planning, but they identified what they thought was most important. And every step we've taken to build FREE as a project and an organization has come from the guidance and prioritization of the conceptual committee. By the time we released our strategic plan in summer 2024, our charge was very clear. We were tasked to create a long-standing resource and knowledge-sharing institution for frontline communities. All of this work is really reflected in the vision and mission of FREE, which was created by the conceptual committee. I actually sat in a Zoom room with 3 of them working on a collaborative document, trying to wordsmith it for about 45 minutes. It was a very fun activity. That's what the work looks like behind the scenes. I won't read them aloud, but I just wanted to feature them because they really get at the ethos of FREE and also the centering of joy, which I think is something that is a under-discussed thing in the environmental movement. So next I want to talk a little bit about what our strategy is, and then I'll speak a bit about what all of this actually looks like in practice, because I know I've been a little bit abstract. So over that 2-year strategic planning process, the conceptual committee landed on 4 key areas where we can best support frontline communities. The first is shared learning, all about creating opportunities for frontline advocates to learn alongside each other, to amplify shared knowledge and cooperative action for environmental and climate justice. Our biggest goal here is to document the collective wisdom of the environmental justice movement and to share stories and truths and lessons really between frontline communities. Our second focus area is technical assistance, where we're working to expand access to technical assistance, but specifically organizational and administrative support, legal assistance, and scientific support for frontline communities. We also have a key focus on funding and development, which means both providing grants directly to frontline communities and also funneling philanthropic and federal funding to those groups. With this goal, we really are just seeking to broaden resource opportunities for frontline advocates. All of those three things really support our last focus area, movement building. We're really looking to connect what we call the 3 Ps, people, policies, and practices, through collective action to create a transformative movement. And this is a multifaceted strategy, but what this looks like behind the scenes is a combination of research, analysis, sharing information, thought leadership, convening people to connect and building spaces for representatives of frontline groups to network and just talk about the issues that they're facing. It's a whole slew of strategies that seek to just create connections between different parts of the movement. What does this actually look like in practice? I'll provide a few examples of our work and how we've been putting these strategies into action, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I actually do. So one example here lies in our support for organizations and securing transformational funding. Our conceptual committee identified that despite a very heavy reliance on grant funding, like many organizations in the environmental world, many community-based organizations do not have the familiarity, experience, or systems in place to successfully apply for and achieve funding and also manage that funding. To address this, we really sought a partner in the grant writing world called Writing for Green to build a collaborative program that responds directly to the needs and the issues that frontline communities are facing in applying for grants. So we built that with them. They're a fantastic partner. A lot of this work is really just forging partnerships and seeing where we can amplify work that's already being done in the space. And with Writing for Green, we trained more than 200 individuals from frontline communities. And we also provided grant writing training and coaching to 1,000 frontline groups from across the country with a partnership with the Institute for Sustainable Communities. So that was really a fantastic piece of our work. We helped frontline communities raise $353 million, I think, which is a pretty staggering statistic. And last year, we also partnered with an organization called Make Justice Normal to host a public arts and climate justice festival in Queens. And I'm realizing I should have put a picture of that here, but I didn't, so I'm sorry. And this was called Streetworks Earth. The festival really explored the intersection between climate, art, community, and what it means for communities to be co-creative and to be taking the reins on convenings and community events. The response to that was amazing. We had over 2,500 people who attended, and it just really demonstrated the clear desire for spaces like that in the movement, and spaces that explored both art and climate and the connections between the two. So what I actually do in all of this is I kind of am the connector between all of the pieces. I both do some project management, but I also do all the research. We are currently at the tail end of conducting a needs assessment that represents over 300 frontline communities that really examines what the actual priorities of these communities are to really help us validate our work, and that is being submitted for publication very soon. We also do other research. We're scoping some really new exciting projects around narratives for frontline communities, around thinking about what the system of what the system of all these players look like. How do intermediary organizations like Free interact with the space around it? I also do a lot of strategy and facilitation, and pretty much anything else that is needed to keep this ship running. I'm the only full-time person on this project, so it's been a big labor of love. And I think that's my first lesson for all of you, is just diving into the work, even if you don't know exactly what you're doing. The year I graduated, I ran a grant cycle that had 300 applications, and I never ran a grant cycle before. I didn't know what I was doing. And there were certainly things that I could have done better, but in the end, everything turned out okay. So I just urge all of you to dive in to whatever is thrown at you after graduation. I also want to highlight something in the examples of our work that I talked about earlier. Each opportunity comes from a direct ask or request from our conceptual committee. As project staff, we really don't assume what we know about what frontline communities need, what their priorities are, and we react to what we're hearing from our partners, from the conceptual committee, from our grantees, and even just from offhand conversations that we're having with some of our beneficiaries. From this mindset of deep listening flows relationships and trust. And all of our decision-making and planning and work, and my work, flows from there. I think the second piece I want to highlight, I will highlight this again later, but it feels good now. More of my work than I thought when I graduated has just been building relationships with people and showing up for people when they need something. So I want to take a moment to, before I get into these lessons learned on the slide, I want to take a moment to talk about why I think my work and the work that we've been doing at EDF is a really interesting and compelling model for how large organizations can show up in this space in a way that's not extractive. The first thing is really authentically and non-paternalistically, I always mess up that word, so I'm glad I got it right this time, centering frontline communities from the conceptualization of our project and including their voices, actually not just including their voices, centering their voices through the entire process. As I discussed before, FREE was the product of hundreds of conversations from the beginning. Then we brought the conceptual committee in to conceptualize, vet, and really make it something that would resonate and be accurately reflective of what frontline communities need. And even now, 3 years later, we're still talking to the conceptual committee every quarter. We still are visiting them when we're in town or when they're in town. We're still trying to convene them in person just to make sure we're on the right track. This is really the opposite of a lot of things that I've seen happening in the environmental space in my short time out of college. Community advisory boards can be brought in as an afterthought or a box checking exercise. And even if it's well done, community engagement in this way isn't effective. Projects need community involvement and centeredness from the start. So what this shows is that when green groups cede power and create space for frontline leaders to do what they do best, the collaboration really can work and it can be very powerful. Another key for FREE's work is that we compensate our conceptual committee. And that someone said to me, I think it was about 2 years ago, they said to me that they had never been compensated for this work before. They had never been compensated for their expertise. They'd sat on many community advisory boards and they were just so grateful to be having their knowledge and their life basically valued at the same way that we value a consultant or that we value a staff member. So that's another piece that is really critical for anyone looking to do this work, and also just for us to really think about what it means to value certain kinds of expertise. And the last thing is moving at the speed of trust. And then I'll get into these. I know they don't match. Overcoming 100 years of mistrust and tension and exclusion does not happen overnight. And I think compensation, collaborative decision-making, et cetera, can go a long way. But it's really, we created this by taking the time for about a year to just talk to people, to just build relationships, build connections. And building trust is just critical for anyone looking to support frontline communities or just looking to be in the environmental field. So with that, I want to transition to the biggest takeaways from my work. Our work really confirms that large environmental organizations have a very critical part to play in supporting frontline communities. Since green groups have really largely set the environmental narrative for the past 100 years, they continue to hold the power to frame the environmental movement, setting the priorities, the agenda items, and really the playing field for policy and planning and advocacy. So when I talk about centering frontline voices in the environmental movement, it's in direct response to that phenomenon of exclusion. Green groups also have a really large role to play in this paradigm shift as a part of recognizing their racist histories in a lot of ways and their the missteps that they've made in the past. They can do this by leveraging their power and their resources to address the resulting disparities from that history. And importantly, that role is not at the forefront of the environmental movement or the environmental justice movement, excuse me. It's not co-opting that, it's not becoming an environmental organization, but it's sitting on the sidelines and letting the groups lead. But to play this part, mainstream environmental organizations should recognize the inherent knowledge, power, and agency of frontline communities. And lastly, this brings us to moving beyond frameworks of community engagement. And what I mean by this is community engagement is a great start when it comes to environmental work, and it's certainly better than nothing, but ultimately work is not reflective of community needs unless the work flows directly from that community and that community's priorities. So moving beyond community engagement means first understanding the environmental and climate justice issues in the realm of your work, identifying the people and frontline stakeholders who are affected by those issues, and ultimately just asking them what their needs and priorities are. From there, the seed of a relationship is planted and transformative work can really begin. That's what community-centeredness looks like. So I've thrown a lot at everyone during the past 30 or so minutes, so I thought it would make sense to close this talk with some final takeaways, both for educators as you all guide students to cultivate the skills and tools necessary to do this work, and for practitioners and students as you might be entering the field and finding your place as a change maker within this movement. But honestly, these takeaways can be relevant to anyone in the audience doing work in your communities, however big or small. So I have three key things for educators, and I think these three things are all, I'm very grateful to say that these are all very true in my experience at Tufts Environmental Studies, and I think I just urge everyone to keep doing these things. The first is creating safe spaces for conversation, critical thinking, and building justice-based learning communities, especially in very trying times in the environmental world, like now with the new administration's actions affecting US federal support for environmental protection and environmental justice. One of the best things that we can do is create community to ask questions, create new narratives, question narratives, and even strategize. The most formative moments of my undergraduate career were found in deep conversation, listening, and questioning my own biases and understandings of the world, and we should really lean into that, as we always have. Secondly, educators should really continue to teach through the lens of different kinds of lived experience. It was here at Tufts that I learned the value of traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, and lived experience, and non-academic perspectives. That planted the seed to do the work that I'm doing now. Valuing lived experience starts in the classroom. I think we all know that in this room, but I think it's a critical thing to say. And lastly, everyone should be really leaning into community partnerships, relationships, and sharing resources, whether that's intellectual resources, partnerships, etc. Community-based organizations are so often in need of pro bono assistance, especially in research and scientific assistance. There's a massive hunger for that kind of work, what I'm hearing from people. And a key place for educators and students to be supporting frontline communities is creating lasting relationships with CBOs and providing support based on their priorities, whether it's partnering for research or for a capstone project or something like that. And finally, I'll finish with some recommendations for practitioners, including the students in the audience. Wherever you go, prioritize bottom-up project development and design. Whether you work at a large environmental organization, the EPA, or in a lab, really try to understand who your work intends to benefit and whether they've been involved in the project development process from the beginning. Develop relationships with these people and continue to show up for them. I think one of the biggest things that I've learned, I'm gonna repeat it, I already said it, is that this working in the environmental field is so much more about relationships than you would think. And I think, you don't learn that until you're in it. It can be very overwhelming, but ultimately it's extremely rewarding. Secondly, really lean into the power of organizational and institutional change. No organization is perfect, even those that do good. And we need good people to show up every day to guide the work in the right direction. the power of collective action can create a ripple effect that changes the trajectory of an entire organization. We've seen that at EDF with our Environmental Justice Council and the vision and principles, and I think there's only more positive change to come. And so I would urge you to feel like you can organize and dream big about how you can change your organization. And lastly, question prevailing ideas about what makes a worthy expert. The significance of valuing lived experience is perhaps the most important lesson I've learned in the field. And it's something that I don't think everyone in the environmental world is doing. Bring an open mind and an open heart into your work, and whatever that work is, you will set yourself up for success as both a change maker and also as a member of the field and in the movement. And with that, I'll close and open up for questions if we have time.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for a wonderful presentation. We do indeed have time for questions. Yes, I see some questions all the way in the back.
Hi, my name is Sierra. I'm a senior at Tufts. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm graduating this year and really hoping to go into community-based environmental justice work. And so I have a question kind of around that relationship building process. When you're making that first step, that first outreach, like what does that look like? Like, is it coffee? Is it a meeting? And how do you kind of balance your positionality coming in from an organization, probably getting compensated to do that relationship building, you know, with an organization or an individual who might not be, and like what are the things you talk about?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much for that. I think it really depends. I think that's that's not a very, very good answer, but it really depends. And I think it depends on, are you local? If you're local, it's absolutely meeting up. I think one of the best ways that you can make that connection and kind of show you're serious about building a connection is by showing up to volunteer or to help out. Or just to ask like, hey, do you need anything? Maybe you're really good at graphic design. Do you need a designer for anything? I'm happy to help out. I think really leveraging your skills and your ability to be reciprocal. I think whatever the action is, it should always be reciprocal. And I think, from an EDF perspective, we really try to compensate community members for anything, really. If they're taking part in a roundtable, if they're answering a survey or something like that, even if it's just a gift card or something like that, or buying them coffee. I love that idea. That's fantastic. And I think it could be anything from those to also, I know of people who have helped community members move, and are personal friends. I think it's really about developing any kind of relationship, and making sure it's reciprocal and multi-directional.
Thank you. I think there's a question.
My question is it's more like a definition thing, but you talked about how EDF is not a community-based organization. Is that just because it's so large, or do you think that it's possible for larger environmental organizations to be community-based, or what would that look like? And is the subsect of EDF that you're a part of, would you call that community-based?
That's a great question. Yes, the lines get very blurry. I think EDF is not a community-based organization because it's not serving a specific group of people, whether that's a group that's bonded by some like shared experience, whether that's culturally, class-based, race-based, like, or literally being in the same region. A lot of CBOs are serving a specific region, but not all of them. And then I think community-based organizations certainly can be large. One great example of a growing community-based organization is We Act for Environmental Justice, based in New York. They have a really, really long history, and they started as just like 3 people trying to organize, and now I think they have over 100 employees. So, but the key is that they're really serving a specific group of people in New York City, and that's how they define their community. I think for us, I would not define our work as a community-based organization. I would describe it, I think, as community-centered or community-driven. since what we seek to do is like support the movement. You know, we're not necessarily the ones who are on the ground kind of organizing we're not the ones who are going to advocate at a state house or at the Capitol. We're trying to support those who do that. So I think, does that help? Awesome.
Hi, my name is Cecilia. I'm a junior, and I'm very passionate about environmental justice. As I was listening, I was wondering if there's any sort of regional or geographic like diversity in the community-based organizations that EDF partners with, or whether you think, or whether you feel like the frontline organizations that EDF partners with are concentrated more heavily in certain areas.
That's a great question. I'll speak first to the partners I work with. So Free's inaugural grantee cohort was from all over. I think we had, I didn't look at this number. I think we had maybe 7 EPA regions, which was, we have folks in California, New York, Puerto Rico, Montana, people from all over. I think from EDF more broadly, we do a lot of work in the South because I think that's where the largest concentration of community-based organizations is, because the South is just notorious for environmental justice issues. But EDF is such a large organization that we work with folks from everywhere. I know our state teams, we have, I think, 7 state teams, and each of them work with separate community partners. So I know we have folks in California, New York, Texas, some folks in the Midwest. So it's from all over, really. Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel, for this inspiring presentation and the important work that you do. As I was listening to you from our previous conversation, so it's clear that you are a tool giver. You support the communities. As you said, it's a community-driven work. So I was wondering if you could share some success stories of a particular project that has benefited from the tools that were given to a particular community.
That's a great question. One that I really love is one of our grantees. We've had a lot of, this is personal opinion and also supported by conversations I've had with our grantees and also with folks across the movement, but there's been a lot of conversation about narrative recently and who controls narratives, who controls frontline stories. Is it the media? Is it the news? And how can frontline groups really own their stories? And one of our grantees from our 2023 grant round used the grant money we provided them to create a documentary. It's the Toxic Prisons Campaign for the Human Rights Coalition. They're based in Pennsylvania, I think Philadelphia. And they really, the documentary, when I watched it, I was like, oh my God, everyone needs to see this. It talks all about the issues of toxic waste in prisons, intersecting with the injustice of just the prison system as a whole, and really makes the connection strongly between how prisons are an environmental justice issue in many ways. And so I think things like that. We had also another group, one of our 4 of our grants in the last round were specifically for strategic planning. And we really wanted folks, and we heard from folks that they wanted time to kind of strategize rather than focusing on project-based work. And we had some really, really cool strategic plans come out of that as well. So there's a whole range of things from, I think, pretty much any sector of an organization, whether it's getting a grant. We had one organization get, I think, like $100 million grant through our partnership with Writing for Green, which was just such a win, through their communications and telling their stories, and even to, you know, just planning for their organization and having more time to breathe and build their programs. It's a very, very broad array of successes.
I think we have time for one more question. Would anyone else?
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, you're talking how it's been hard to get like these bigger environmental organizations to start note or like taking notice or centering environmental justice. As you've been doing that kind of work at EDF, have you noticed those other groups that are like pure organizations doing that kind of work as well, or still not really seeing it?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of movement from the green groups to kind of bring that in. A lot of them have kind of counterparts to our team. They're not necessarily called justice and equity, but a lot of they'll have environmental justice focused teams, and we're in direct contact with all of those folks. We've been doing some really cool work. One of my colleagues, Ikra Ahmed, has been doing just fantastic work trying to coordinate all of them and really kind of build bridges between all of the organizations at the level of the lead of those teams so that we can all kind of coordinate. It's definitely kind of catching fire, and I think it'll be really interesting and exciting to see what happens over the next few years, especially just given the political context that we're in right now.
I think we have time for at least.
Yeah. Thanks for this. It's super interesting. You touched on the current administration there, like specifically going after things named, EJ or whatever. And I don't know, I was curious as, do you guys get federal funding? Do you anticipate them kind of targeting you or other environmental justice or environmental justice organizations?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I was sitting with this talk, and I was like, oh, I don't know how much I could talk about just that for 40 minutes. So I think we don't receive federal funding ourselves. So it's not necessarily a kind of existential issue for us, but we've really had to reroute, especially since a lot of our work, especially the grant writing piece, did initially have a big federal funding focus because there was so much with Justice 40 and the Inflation Reduction Act. There were billions of dollars for environmental justice from the federal government. And now either it has a very uncertain fate in a lot of ways. So we've had to reroute a bit and really kind of reinvigorate a focus on philanthropic funding. And the second piece is, I think I was looking yesterday at a slide of just all of the things environmental justice that are essentially going to, or at risk, are going to go away because of that executive order. I can't remember which number it is. Among them are likely the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, the fate of the National Environmental Justice Council, which is the EPA's version, is a bit uncertain. The Office of Environmental Justice at the EPA is a bit uncertain. So we're really trying to archive all of the information from those sites so that it doesn't get lost when the administration inevitably removes all of the archives of decades of decisions from those councils. I think, yeah, it's going to be a really interesting reroute. I think the movement's still a little bit in flux, and leaders are kind of trying to strategize and figure out what our next steps are. But we're really focusing on trying to find alternative funding streams for frontline organizations, because I think the lack of federal funding is going to be a big challenge for them to overcome after 4 years of having a lot of federal attention on environmental justice.
I would like to ask a more professional question. In general, a more professional in general question. After this great question, there are maybe students in the room considering working at one of those big green organizations. So I was wondering if you could talk about what it is like to work at a big nonprofit, and also what can a student do while they're still a staff to gain the skills or to make themselves more attractive in their employment looking prospects?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I'm happy to speak to that. Working at EDF is fantastic. I really love working at EDF in a lot of ways. I'm really, really grateful to get to do the work that I do. It's very fast paced. There's a lot of shifting kind of deadlines and priorities and lots of things happening at once, especially if you're working in the environmental justice space at these organizations. So I definitely think time management, prioritization, and just being able to kind of keep all your ducks in a row in crisis is really critical. One of the things I do love about working at EDF is work-life balance. Even though a lot of people in the environmental justice movement can't, have that kind of work-life balance, it's been really wonderful. The culture, at least of my team at EDF, is just always prioritizing the person over the work, which is just a wonderful thing. And I think not something you find at every organization. The other really wonderful thing about working at a larger organization and especially to do this work is, many people don't get compensated for the kind of work that I do, or they don't get compensated very much. And I think it's a big privilege to be able to have, a salary and benefits and be financially stable, but also do work where I feel like I'm pushing the needle and really making a difference in the movement and kind of resisting a lot of the scary changes that are happening right now in the world. I'm trying to think, is there anything else that I missed on that? Oh. Yes, time management, which I think I learned my time management and prioritization skills here for sure. I think any tough student is a great candidate for an organization like EDF, but I think technically, and I was telling you this earlier, taking GIS was one of the best decisions I made. And I know not everyone will like to hear that, but I'm not a quantitative person, and having the GIS understanding really, I think, gave me a leg up in just not just getting a job, but also navigating the world and understanding a lot of the kind of tools that people are doing and the research that is happening in the space. Soft skills, I think, be curious, ask questions, and don't just do it in class. Ask questions with your friends, have serious conversations. Just make sure that you're always questioning what you're receiving, whether that's a narrative, a system. Think critically. And I think those are the biggest skills in my mind.